I still remember the smell before I remember the sound. That's a strange thing to say, I know. People always ask about the noise first. Everybody wants to know how loud it was, whether it knocked you off your feet, whether your ears rang for days. And yes, all of that is true. But when I close my eyes and go back to that morning near the Meridian Gate, the first thing that comes back isn't the blast. It's the smell of the flower carts. Lilies and cut roses and that green, wet smell of stems freshly trimmed. Because the market women had been setting up since before dawn, the way they always did on a festival morning. Funny what the mind holds onto. My name doesn't matter much for this story. I was a clerk back then, 19 years old, working the records office 2 streets down from the Palace of Aldermere. I only mention myself so you understand I'm not some grand historian looking back from a comfortable chair. I was there. I saw it. I saw him. And I've spent a lot of years since trying to tell people what I saw without it sounding like a fairy tale, because it wasn't. It was the most real thing that ever happened to me. Let me set it properly for you. Aldermere was a small kingdom, the sort of place most people couldn't find on a map. We sat between two larger powers, the way small countries always seem to, and we survived by being useful and quiet and stubborn. The capital was called Harrowmere, an old stone city built along a slow gray river, and at the heart of it stood the palace with its famous gates, 5 of them, each named for a virtue the old kings had believed in: mercy, valor, wisdom, silence. And Meridian, the great front gate, named for the noon sun, because it faced due south and caught the light square in the middle of the day. The Meridian Gate was where the guards stood. You've seen the pictures, I'm sure, even if you've never been. The tall bearskin hats, though ours were a deep charcoal gray rather than black. The long red coats with the silver frogging across the chest. The boots you could see your face in. Tourists came from everywhere just to watch them. Children would stand an inch from their faces and pull silly expression, trying to make them laugh, and the guards never so much as blinked. It was a game the whole city was in on. The guards didn't move. That was the whole point of them. That was the promise they made just by standing there. Whatever happens, we do not move. I'd walked past those men 1,000 times. I'll be honest, I'd stopped seeing them. They were furniture. They were part of the wall. You stopped noticing the things that never change. His name was Corwin Ashfield. I'd learned that later. That morning he was just a guard, one of 2 flanking the Meridian Gate, and I couldn't have picked him out of a crowd if my life depended on it. By the end of the day, I'd never forget his face as long as I lived. It was the 3rd of Harvest Month, the morning of the founding festival, the biggest day of the Aldermere year. The whole city came out for it. There was a parade planned for noon, and the young prince, Prince Aldous, the king's second son, barely 20, was meant to ride through the Meridian Gate at the head of it. That was tradition. The heir did the parade one year, the spare did it the next. It kept both boys in the public eye, kept the crowds fond of them. Small kingdoms live and die on whether the people are fond of you. So the streets were packed. I mean packed the way a city only gets a few times a year, shoulder to shoulder, everyone in their good clothes, the children up on their father's shoulders. The flower women were out. The chestnut sellers, even though it was too warm for chestnuts. Somebody was playing a fiddle badly near the fountain and nobody minded. The sky was that pale washed blue you get in early autumn, high and clear, and I remember thinking it was going to be a perfect day. I was there on an errand, if you can believe it. My supervisor at the records office had sent me to deliver a sealed packet to one of the palace clerks, and I was cutting through the festival crowd near the gate, grumbling under my breath about being sent out on the one day when walking anywhere took 3 times as long. I was pushing through the press of people, maybe 40 feet from the Meridian Gate, when I first noticed something was off. It was the horse. Not the parade horses, those weren't out yet. This was a cart horse, an old bay pulling a covered wagon up the wrong side of the square against the flow, its driver working it hard toward the gate. A festival morning, and here's a delivery wagon shoving through a crowd that thick. People were annoyed. A woman shouted at the driver to watch himself. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just kept the horse moving. one hand on the reins, the other tucked inside his coat, and his eyes were fixed on the gate with a kind of flat, terrible focus that I can only describe now, all these years later, because at the time I didn't have a word for it. At the time I just felt my stomach go cold. You know that feeling, when your body knows something is wrong before your mind has caught up. I looked at the guards. Corwin Ashfield had already seen him. I could tell, though I couldn't have told you how. The guard hadn't moved, he was still standing at attention, still statue, still perfect. But something in him had changed. It was like watching still water when a shadow passes over it. Nothing on the surface, everything underneath. His eyes had found the cart driver and locked on and would not let go. The other guard hadn't clocked it yet. He was younger, I think, or just less sharp that morning. He was still doing the job of standing there. Corwin was doing something else now. Corwin was waiting. The cart was 30 feet from the gate. I want to tell you I did something. I want to tell you I shouted a warning, grabbed a child, did anything at all. I didn't. I froze the way most people freeze, the packet of papers still tucked under my arm, my mouth half open, my feet nailed to the cobblestones. That's the honest truth of it. Most of us are not heroes when the moment comes. Most of us are just witnesses. 20 feet. The driver's hand came out of his coat. I couldn't see what was in it. Nobody could, not from where we stood, but Corwin saw enough. And here is the thing I've turned over in my head 10,000 times since, the thing that still stops my breath. He had a choice in that half second. Every man at that gate had a choice. The wall behind him had a small door, a guard's door, and a man could have stepped through it and been behind 3 feet of stone before anything happened. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody even would have known. You could save yourself, and no living soul would ever call you a coward, because no living soul would have seen you choose. Corwin didn't step back. He stepped forward. He broke his post, the one thing a guard of the Meridian Gate is never, ever supposed to do, and he broke it not to run but to close the distance, moving off the mark he'd stood on for 3 hours and putting his own body between the cart and the gate, between the cart and the crowd of children and flower women and fathers with their sons on their shoulders. He shouted something. I couldn't hear the words over the noise of the square. But I saw his arm come up, and I saw the driver flinch, and I saw the old bay horse rear. And then the smell of the flowers was gone, and there was only light and heat, and a sound so big it wasn't a sound anymore, just a wall that hit me and threw me down onto the stones with everyone else. I don't know how long I was down. It couldn't have been long, seconds maybe, but time does something strange in a moment like that. It stretches and folds, and when I opened my eyes and got my hands under me, the world had gone quiet in the worst way, not silent. My ears were roaring, a high thin whine that drowned out everything, so that all around me people were screaming and I couldn't hear them. I could only see their open mouths. It was like watching the whole square scream underwater. There was smoke, gray and greasy, rolling low across the cobblestones. There were flowers everywhere, blown loose from the carts, lilies scattered across the ground like somebody had thrown them for a wedding. I remember a single white rose lying on the stones an inch from my hand, perfect, untouched, and I remember staring at it like it was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. I got up. My legs didn't want to hold me, but they did, and I looked toward the gate. The cart was gone, just gone, splintered wood and worse. I won't describe it. Some things a man shouldn't say out loud. The younger guard was down, thrown against the base of the wall, moving though, thank every god, trying to sit up. The great iron of the Meridian Gate was scorched black, but it was standing. It was still standing. 300 years old, and it took the blow and it held. And in front of it, between the ruin of the cart and the gate he was sworn to guard, was Corwin Ashfield. He was on the ground. He was not moving the way the young guard was moving. He was down, and there was a stillness to him that was different from the stillness he'd held all morning, and I understood it and refused to understand it in the same breath. I don't remember deciding to run to him. I just remember I was there on my knees on the hot stones beside him, The packet of papers gone from under my arm, gone forever, and I never did find out what was in it. His gray bearskin had come off. He looked younger without it. He looked like somebody's son. His eyes were open. He was alive. I want you to hear that because I know how it's been sounding, and I need you to hear that in this part of the story at this moment on those cobblestones under that pale autumn sky, Corwin Ashfield was alive, badly hurt, bleeding, but his eyes found mine and they focused and his lips moved. I leaned down close because my ears were still roaring and I couldn't hear. And what he said, I'll tell you what he said in a moment. Because to understand why those few words mattered so much, why they'd end up changing the whole course of the kingdom, why people would still be arguing about them years later, you have to understand who was riding toward that gate at that exact moment, just out of sight down the parade route, and you have to understand what the crown of Aldermere looked like the morning before it broke. But that's the next part of the story. Before I tell you what Corwin said to me on those stones, I have to take you back a few hours, back before the smoke, back into the palace itself, where none of them yet knew the morning was going to break in half. I wasn't inside the palace that morning, of course. I was a records clerk, not a courtier. But in the years after, I heard the story so many times from so many people who were there that I feel like I stood in that room myself. The maids told it. The kitchen boys told it. Old Sir Bramwell, the king's steward, told it near the end of his life to anyone who'd buy him a drink, and I bought him a good many. So what I'm giving you now is a stitched-together thing, but it's true. As true as memory gets. The trouble in the house of Aldermere had nothing to do with bombs at first. It was an older, quieter kind of trouble, the kind that happens inside families with too much to inherit. King Havard was old and not well. Everyone knew it, though no one said it above a whisper. He'd ruled Aldermere for 31 years, and he'd ruled it decently, no great wars, no great famines, which for a small kingdom is about the highest praise there is. But his body was failing him now, and the question that hangs over every failing king had begun to hang over him. Who comes next? By every law and custom, the answer was simple. His elder son, Prince Rowan, was the heir. That was that. Rowan was 30, serious, a little cold, the sort of man who read reports late into the night and knew the price of grain in every province. He'd make a fine king. Nobody doubted it. The trouble was Lady Cedra. I have to be careful here, telling this part, because I know how these things go. When something goes wrong in a royal house, everyone wants a villain, and the easiest villain to reach for is always the woman who married in. I've heard Lady Cedra called 100 ugly things over the years, and I don't think most of them were fair. But I don't think she was innocent either. The truth, like most truths, sat somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Lady Cedra was the king's second wife. He'd married her late, a good 15 years after the boy's mother died, and the court had never quite warmed to her. She was clever, sharper than the king, some said, and she'd spent those 15 years quietly gathering the strings of the household into her own hands. Who saw the king? Who didn't? What letters reached his desk? What news he heard, and what news somehow never arrived? By that autumn, if you wanted anything from King Havard, you went through Lady Cedra first, and a great many people had come to resent it. Now here is the knot of it. King Havard, in his last failing months, had begun to lean on her more and more, and Lady Cedra had begun, ever so gently, to whisper a new idea into the old king's ear, that perhaps Prince Rowan was too cold to be loved by the people, that perhaps the younger boy, Prince Aldous, sunny, easy, charming Aldous, who everyone adored, would make a warmer king, and that perhaps the succession ought to be reconsidered. It was poison, and it was clever poison because it wasn't entirely a lie. Aldous was better loved. That was the maddening part. The people did adore the younger prince, and a frightened old king, wanting to be remembered fondly, wanting to leave behind a crown the people would cheer for. That's a king who might listen to a whisper like that. There were papers being drawn up. That's the part almost nobody knew that autumn morning. Sir Bramwell told me about them years later, his hands shaking around his cup. A decree of altered succession. Not signed yet, but drafted and sitting in a locked drawer in the king's study, waiting for a hand too tired to keep refusing. And here is the cruelest thread of all, the one that ties this whole story into a single knot. It was Prince Aldous who was meant to ride through the Meridian Gate at noon that day. The younger prince, the people's favorite, riding at the head of the founding parade, waving to the crowds who loved him, on the very morning the papers that would make him king were closest to being signed. Somebody wanted the people to see Aldous crowned in their hearts before he was ever crowned in law. Now hold all of that in your mind. The old king wavering, the cold elder son about to be passed over, the younger son riding toward the gate, the clever stepmother with the papers in the drawer. Hold all of it, because a cart horse was coming up the wrong side of the square, and a man in a gray bearskin was about to decide the future of the kingdom with his own body, and he didn't know a single thing about the papers in the drawer. That's the part that still undoes me. Corwin Ashfield saved the man who was about to be made king, and he never even knew it. He didn't step forward to protect the succession. He didn't step forward for politics or for papers or for any grand thing at all. He stepped forward because there were children in that square. Let me bring you back to the stones now. Back to me, 19 years old, kneeling in the smoke with my ear to a dying man's mouth. Except, and I've thought about this word so carefully, he wasn't dying. Not yet, not that minute. That's important. Corwin's eyes found mine and his lips moved, and I leaned in close, and over the roaring in my ears I heard him say, very clearly, 3 words. Is the boy safe? That was it. That was all he wanted to know. Not am I dying, not help me, not my wife, my children, tell them, none of the things you'd expect. He'd thrown his whole body between a bomb and a gate, and lying broken on the stones, the only thing left in him was the question of whether it had worked. Is the boy safe? I didn't even know which boy he meant. The prince, I assumed later. He must have known Aldous was riding today. They all knew the parade route. But I've come to think he might have meant any boy. Every boy. All the children in that square with the flowers blown loose around them. I told him yes. I didn't know if it was true, but I told him yes because it was the only thing in the world I could give him. The boy's safe, I said. You did it. Everyone's safe. And I watched something go out of him, not his life, not yet, but the effort, the terrible holding on. He heard me say the boy was safe and he let the effort go, and his eyes drifted up past me to the pale autumn sky. That's when the palace guard reached us. A whole tide of them, red coats pouring out through the Meridian Gate and the smaller doors, and behind them the physicians, and behind them, and I'll never forget this, the parade itself, halted, and at the front of it, still on his white horse, frozen with his hand halfway raised in a wave he'd never finished, Prince Aldous. The younger prince had seen the whole thing. He'd been maybe 100 feet back, just turning onto the square, close enough to see the cart and the guard and the blast. Close enough to understand, in the way you understand a thing in your gut before your mind agrees, that the man on the ground had died in the space he himself had been riding toward. Aldous got down off the horse. A prince in the middle of a parade in front of the whole city, he got down and he walked, and then he ran, through the smoke and the scattered flowers. And he dropped to his knees on the other side of Corwin Ashfield across from me. This 19-year-old clerk he'd never met and never would meet again. And the two of us knelt there together over the guard, while the physicians tried to work. I have never in my life seen a man's face do what the prince's face did. He was looking at Corwin like he was trying to memorize him, like he understood already that he'd owe this stranger something he could never pay back, and the least he could do was look and not look away and be there for it. Corwin's eyes were still on the sky. He asked if the boy was safe, I told the prince. I don't know why I said it, it just came out of me. That's all he asked. And Prince Aldous, I watched this happen. Prince Aldous took the guard's hand in both of his, this bloodied stranger's hand, and he bent down close and he said, "The boy is safe. Because of you. Do you hear me? Because of you." I don't know if Corwin heard him. I'd like to believe he did. His eyes were still open, still turned up toward that high clear blue, and there was no fear in them at all, just a kind of quiet. The quiet of a man who'd stood his post and knew it. Corwin Ashfield died 4 days later. I want to be honest with you about that because the story often gets told as though he died right there on the stones, heroic and instant, and that's cleaner, but it isn't true. He held on for 4 days in the palace infirmary, and for the first 2 of them the physicians even had hope. The prince visited him every one of those 4 days, sat by the bed for hours. And on the 3rd day, when Corwin surfaced enough to speak, they say the 2 of them talked, the prince and the guard, and no one knows what was said, because Aldous sent everyone out of the room, and he never told a living soul. But I've always believed something was decided in that room, something that mattered, because of what the prince did next. You see, word of the whole thing spread through Harrowmere faster than any fire. The guard who stepped forward, the cart that came up the wrong side of the square, the prince who got down off his horse and ran through the smoke and knelt in the blood in his festival whites. By nightfall it was in every tavern in the city, and by the next morning it was in every village for 50 miles, and the story grew the way true stories grow, gathering weight as it goes. And it reached the palace. It reached the old king's sick room. It reached, eventually, the locked drawer with the unsigned papers in it. Because here's what the people of Aldermere took from that day, and once the people take a thing into their hearts you cannot pry it back out. They didn't just love Prince Aldous now. They loved him more, yes, for getting down off that horse. But it was tangled up now with something else. With the guard. With the idea of a man who steps forward. With the idea that the highest thing a person can do is put their own body between danger and the people they're sworn to protect. And the question started going around the taverns, quietly at first and then not quietly at all. Which of our princes is the man who steps forward? That question was about to walk straight into the palace and stand in front of the throne, because the succession wasn't settled yet. The papers were still in the drawer. And what happened in the days after Corwin Ashfield died, the confrontation in the king's study, the thing Lady Cedra never saw coming, and the true meaning of the words carved onto the guard's memorial stone, is the last part of this story. I'll tell you all of it. They buried Corwin Ashfield on a gray morning 8 days after the festival. The rain held off, which everyone said was a mercy, though the sky stayed low and heavy the whole time, that flat pewter color that seems to press down on your shoulders. I went. Of course I went. Half of Harrowmere went. The road from the palace to the old soldiers' ground was lined the whole way with people standing quiet in the cold. And there were flowers again. Lilies, roses, the same flowers that had been blown across the square, as if the whole city had agreed without a word that the flowers had to be part of it now. I'd learned things about him by then. That's what happens after. The man becomes a name, and then the name gathers a life around it. Corwin Ashfield was 34. He had a wife named Marin and 2 small daughters, and he'd been a guard for 11 years. And before that he'd been a farmer's son from a village up north where the soil was too thin to keep more than one boy. He wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't anybody's cousin. He was a farmer's second son who'd come to the city with nothing and made himself into a man who stood at the Meridian Gate. And when the worst morning of the kingdom's life came, he was the one who stepped forward. His widow walked behind the coffin with a daughter's hand in each of hers. I couldn't look at them for long. I don't think anyone could. And walking behind her on foot, bareheaded in the cold, was Prince Aldous. That wasn't done. Princes don't walk in a common guard's funeral procession. Princes send a wreath and a kind letter and stand on a balcony. But Aldous walked the whole way in the ranks of ordinary mourners, and when they lowered Corwin into the ground it was the prince who spoke, not from a height, not from a platform, just standing at the edge of the grave with the wind pulling at his coat. He didn't say much. I remember it almost word for word. "I was riding toward that gate," he said. "I would have ridden right into it. I'd be in the ground today, and this good man would be standing his post tomorrow, and the kingdom would have lost far less than it lost." He stopped. He had to. Then, he asked one thing at the end. He asked if the boy was safe. He didn't mean the prince. A man like that doesn't step forward for a prince. He meant every child in that square. He looked around at the crowd, at all of us. I am alive because of a man who never once thought about who I was, only who I might get to protect. If I ever wear the crown, I want to wear it the way he wore that coat, or I don't want it at all. If I ever wear the crown. There were people in that graveyard who caught those words and understood exactly what they meant, because by then, the whole city knew the succession was unsettled. And here was the younger prince, the one Lady Cedra had been grooming, the one the papers in the drawer were meant to lift onto the throne, standing at a dead guard's grave saying he'd rather have no crown at all than wear it wrong. Word of that reached the palace before the prince did. I wasn't in the king's study for what came next. I want to keep being honest with you about the seams in this story, about where I stood and where I only heard. But Sir Bramwell was in the room, standing against the wall the way stewards do, and he told it to me more than once, and it never changed in the telling, which is how you know an old man isn't lying. It was 3 days after the funeral. King Havard had the papers out on the desk in front of him at last. The decree of altered succession Rowan set aside, Aldous named heir. Lady Cedra had brought it to him herself, and she'd chosen her moment well, because the old king was frightened and tired, and the whole city was in love with his younger son. And it seemed, that afternoon, like the easiest thing in the world to simply give the people what they so clearly wanted. He had the pen in his hand. And Prince Aldous walked in. He hadn't been summoned. He walked in unannounced, still half in mourning gray, and he saw the papers on the desk, and he saw the pen in his father's hand, and Bramwell said the prince went very still, the way, I always thought when I heard it, the way Corwin had gone still at the gate. That water with a shadow over its stillness. "What is that?" Aldous said, not really a question. Lady Cedra answered for the king, smooth as ever. She told him it was a joyous thing, that the people loved him, that his father wished to honor that love, that the crown would pass to him, and wasn't that a wonderful gift on this of all weeks, when the whole kingdom had seen his courage at the gate. And Prince Aldous looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something no one expected. He crossed the room, and he picked up the papers, and he tore them in half. Bramwell said the sound of it was the loudest thing he ever heard in that quiet room. Lady Cedra came up out of her chair. The old king just stared, and Aldous stood there holding the two halves of the decree that would have made him king, and he said, "And this is the part that got carved into the kingdom's memory. This is the part they still teach the children. I did nothing at that gate. I sat on a horse and watched a better man than me die. You want to make me king for courage. The courage that day belonged to Corwin Ashfield, and he's in the ground. And you cannot put a crown on a grave. You can only try to be worthy of it." Then he turned to his father, and Bramwell said his voice changed, went gentle, went like a son's voice again. "Rowan is the heir. Rowan has always been the heir. He's colder than me and quieter than me, and the people don't cheer for him the way they cheer for me, and none of that has anything to do with whether he'll be a good king. He reads the reports, father. He knows the price of grain. He'll stand his post. Give it to him. Give it to him the way it was always meant to go, and let me be what I actually am, the brother who stands beside him. That's a good thing to be. That's enough." And the old king, the frightened, tired, wavering old king, began to weep. Whether from shame or relief or simple love of his son, no one could say. But he set down the pen, and the papers stayed torn. Lady Cedra left the court within the month. There's a whole other story in that, in how her strings came loose all at once, in how a household that had feared her for 15 years suddenly discovered it didn't have to anymore. But that's not this story. This story is about the guard. King Havard died the following spring quietly in his sleep, which is more than most kings get. And Prince Rowan became King Rowan exactly as the law had always intended, and he ruled Aldermere for 26 years, and Sir Bramwell was right about him. He was cold and he was quiet, and the people never cheered him the way they cheered his brother, and he was one of the finest kings the little kingdom ever had. He knew the price of grain. He stood his post. And Prince Aldous stood beside him the whole way, the brother who might have been king and gave it back. There was never a day of trouble between those two men, which anyone who knows the history of royal brothers will tell you is nearly a miracle. When people asked Aldous in his later years why he'd torn up the papers, why he'd handed away a crown that was his for the taking, he'd always give the same answer. He'd say, "A man once asked me if the boy was safe. I've spent my whole life trying to be the kind of man who'd deserve the question." They built the memorial the year after the festival. It stands there still, just inside the Meridian Gate where anyone passing through can see it. A simple thing. A stone figure of a guard, not grand, not heroic-looking, just a man in a long coat standing at attention the way they stand every day. Most tourists walk right past it without a glance. It's easy to miss. It looks like part of the wall. I think Corwin would have liked that. There's an inscription carved into the base. Prince Aldous chose the words himself, and people expected something grand, something about kings and courage and the fate of the kingdom. That's not what he chose. What's carved into that stone, in letters worn soft now by all the years of rain, is only this. He stepped forward. That's all, 3 words. The same number he spoke to me on the cobblestones with the flowers blown loose around us. You could read the whole thing and not understand it if you didn't know the story. Most people don't anymore. It was a long time ago. The old king is dust, and King Rowan is dust, and even Prince Aldous, who lived to be very old, is gone now, and the little kingdom of Aldermere is just a quiet name on a map that most people can't find. But I was there. I was 19 years old, and I knelt on those stones, and I heard him ask his one question, and I lied to comfort him, and I'll never be sorry I did. I've lived a long life since. I've told this story 1,000 times. And every autumn, when the sky goes that pale washed blue and there's a green wet smell of cut stems in the market, I feel it all come back, and I go and stand by the little stone that looks like part of the wall. I think about how most of us, when the worst moment comes, we freeze. We're witnesses. That's not a shame, it's just the truth of most people, myself first among them. But every so often, once in a generation, in a square full of people who can't move, one man does. He steps forward, and the whole world turns on it, and never even knows.